A question was recently posed to me by a longtime meditator, someone I've known for a long time as well. The question is, if each soul is God, why does God like to suffer so much? It's a good question, and I know this person is aware of the fact that I have also contemplated similar things for a long time. And this is one of the beauties of meditation and even the Kriya Yoga process, is that by practicing our meditation techniques, we can learn to turn our attention within and get answers to our spiritual questions such as this. The answers don't typically come immediately, although sometimes they do, the better you get at the whole process. But they will reveal themselves over the course of the days and months and even years that we contemplate such things. So this is why I'm a big proponent, not of just doing meditation techniques to get in a calm state, but to practice contemplative meditation, where after you're calm and clear, you take the question and you think it through and you wonder about it until the answer dawns within your awareness. And I have to admit that while this process took me a long time to get any kind of proficiency with, so far I've not had any questions that have not been answered at least partially. And those questions that have been answered partially, I continue to contemplate, knowing that just like many of the other questions that I've had throughout my life, philosophical questions, spiritual questions, that all questions can eventually be answered through our internal work and through our internal processes. This is a topic in the book Kriya Yoga Vichara, where we discuss the ideas of using the meditation techniques, but then moving into a contemplative space to get the answers to our spiritual questions. So I'd like to encourage you, if you've got that book, to find the chapter on contemplative practices, contemplative processes, and follow the step-by-step procedures so that you get experience figuring this stuff out for yourself. Because even if you have a spiritual mentor or teacher or someone that you trust who can figure these things out, it'll never be satisfying until you actually know it for yourself. In the same way that knowing God, knowing divine consciousness is never satisfying for you if someone else is experiencing it or just telling you about it or talking about it. So first and foremost, when we have these kinds of questions, you have to realize that it's important to explore them with intensity on your own until the realization dawns. And the best way to do that, first and foremost, is to attend to your own meditation techniques until you can access that clear, thought-free state. And then with a curious and objective attitude, hold these questions in your awareness. Because it's true that consciousness, this reality that we are all a part of, does respond to our quandaries, our thoughts, our wonderings, does respond to our intentions. Sometimes not as clearly as others, but that's usually because we're not clear in our own asking, or we're not as intensive in our own asking. So back to this question. If each soul is God, why does God like to suffer so much? Well, this is a good question, but as with all types of exploration, there are a few steps that are skipped by jumping right to this idea of if each soul is God, why does God like to suffer so much? Well, first of all, we need to contemplate and understand, what do we mean by soul? What do we mean by God? And what do we mean by suffering? Some people define the soul as this immortal aspect of ourself. That's not been my experience. The idea of the soul, in my experience, has been the individualized aspect, facet of this wholeness. this thing that we call God or divine consciousness, an individualized aspect. So essentially, it is your mind, your emotions, your tendencies, your preferences, your aversions. These are all things that I would consider to be the soul. In a sense, it's like the blueprint that makes your body and your life here in this current time-space continuum. And as you evolve through time and space, the preferences, the understanding, the emotions, all that changes through time. And so your soul evolves and changes through time as well. So we have to, at first, kind of contemplate what do we mean by the idea of soul. And I've just shared with you what I have experienced it to be. The idea of God is another thing. Everyone has an idea of what they think or imagine God to be. Some people think it's a benevolent parent up in the sky, dealing out punishment and giving rewards. Some people think it's completely unknowable. Some people consider it to be the innate intelligence that makes everything happen. Some of us think that, or feel that it is everything, the wholeness of life, which goes back to this question. If each soul is God, why does God like to suffer so much? Well, if we remember that everything is God, which I always say, and I've gotten in trouble for saying before, if everything is God, then of course our innate quirks, idiosyncrasies, personality, choices, preferences, that's all God as well. It's just that that ego identification of the soul is one small facet, one small piece of the greater gem of this divine consciousness. And so the question then goes on, why does God like to suffer so much? Well, we don't know if God likes to suffer so much because we don't necessarily know exactly what God is. So my advice would be figure out what God really is first and foremost, beyond the idea of conceptualizing God as only soul. Yes, God is soul, but God is everything else as well. And so it may be that God doesn't like to suffer, and it may be even that God doesn't suffer. And that's why many teachers who have been known or said to experience self-realization, God-realization, things can happen to them that would devastate normal people identified with their mind, body, and personality. Yet they say, well, what will be, will be. This is all divine will. They may not know exactly what that divine will is, but they may trust that their life is only a small portion of this greater sense of individuality. And that when we can identify with God, or the wholeness of life, which is everything, maybe what we consider to be suffering makes sense. In the same way that you only know what you do want by experiencing what you don't want. But the problem is that the idea of the soul wants everything its way, wants to experience its small life, making the choices that it makes, and having everything work out as if those choices were the most important thing in the world. When really, it may be that suffering occurs due to a lack of perspective. Now, that's not to say that suffering is very real for us. We all go through difficult times. Sometimes things occur that we wish would never, ever, ever, ever happen, and yet they do. And when that happens, we have a couple options. We can question, well, if everything is God, if each soul is God, then why does God like to suffer? Well, that's assuming that God is limited to this perspective where this pain occurs. But maybe that's not true. And through my experience, I've found that when things get extremely difficult, it's easy to throw up your hands and just take the easy way out through escapist tendencies, or not even trying to wonder and be curious about the whys and so on. But by developing something like prayer or contemplation, even in the midst of pain, there's a possibility of knowing why what happens, happens, knowing why what we define as suffering is occurring. So really, when we think about it, we have to be very clear on our questions. What do we mean by soul? What do we mean by God? What do we mean by suffering? Is it possible that what we really need to focus on is actually knowing God, trying to have a sense of communion with God, to see things from the eyes of God? But the little soul, despite all its talk of wanting to unite with God and be devoted to God, and despite all the talk of all the little spiritual seekers who say they want to be a part of the whole, they never let go of their limited sense of self, and so never actually truly gain the perspective of God or divine consciousness. And if they could, even in the midst of suffering, maybe, possibly, they could catch a glimpse of something greater and see just why the suffering is occurring. Or that might not be possible. Maybe they'll develop a greater sense of faith and realizing that there's a plan, there is an organization to life that we just can't quite understand. And we have to look to nature and see how nature functions and see the renewal of life as we go through winter to spring to summer to fall, when things pass on and die, to winter again, to spring, fall, summer, and so on. At least that's in my hemisphere or my neck of the woods, how that functions. But there's always this renewal. And with each loss, with each perceived suffering, if the leaves turn brown and falling, there's a new season just on the other side of winter. That doesn't mean that also we can't grieve when things go wrong. That's a natural part of being embodied in this world. And to fight it is to repress ourselves and cause probably psychological damage. Grief, tears, longing, yearning, sorrow, everything has its time. And sometimes all we can do is hold on and embrace it. As one person once told me, all we're here to do in this body is to burn off our karmas. And sometimes that's the karmas of the most horrendous thing in the world. Sometimes that's the karma of sitting by the pool with your friends. Sometimes it's the karma of working. Sometimes it's the karma of having food poisoning. Sometimes it's the karma of having a beautiful relationship. But all we are doing with this physical body is exhausting this karma, which is why numerous practices extol this idea of surrender, and even Vasista's yoga, that our role is to simply allow the pent-up force of our intentions to exhaust itself. And then when suffering occurs, if that's part of it, and we're able to hold on and stay true to our faith and stay as internalized as possible and grieving when we need to, but continuing to stay centered within ourselves, maybe we'll feel much lighter, maybe we'll feel much clearer, maybe we'll have learned something, maybe we'll be a more integrated human being because we have exhausted, burnt through that karma. I don't know. It's different for everybody. It's been my experience. And not everyone who goes through difficulty comes out the other end in any kind of happier place. Why is that? I'm not sure. But as you know, sometimes people make a bigger mess of things. Rather than surrendering to a process, they try to fix it every which way to Tuesday, and they end up putting more intentions into play that just cause more and more karma. So this is not an easy question to answer, and there's all kinds of variables to contemplate, but what I would like to encourage you to do is to contemplate it until you have the direct understanding, and that understanding will come as a certainty as soon as you commit to it, as soon as you give yourself to it day in, day out, months, years, however long it takes. Because this isn't going to be easy. I mean, people go to become a medical doctor or get their PhD, 8-10 years of commitment, and we think that we're going to have our spiritual questions answered tomorrow. But the more you do it, the more you get involved, the more natural it becomes, until it gets to the point where you can simply ask a question, contemplate, and have the immediate response. It may not be the response you want, but it will be there. It becomes natural. And it may not be that you can explain it to someone else, because until they've contemplated it for themselves, it doesn't matter what you say, however logical it is, however much greater knowing there is behind the realization they experience. If someone else has not come to that by their own contemplative processes, their own communion with the greater aspect of themselves, it still won't make any sense. Which is why any kind of argument about religions or philosophies or ideals is really a total waste of time. So to summarize, there's a lot to think about. But my response would be, if each soul is God, why does God like to suffer so much? My response would be, based on my own contemplations and prayer, is that God doesn't like to suffer so much. And it may be even that God doesn't suffer. But we, the little ego, a little sense of identification with a body, a mind, a spirit, an intention, a direction, this is the way things should be, that's what suffers. And what we really need to do is get to the bottom up, get to the very most fundamental root with certainty through our contemplative practices of what is God. And then from there, figure out, well, in relationship to God, what is the soul truly? It is an aspect of God, just like your hand is an aspect of your body. It is all one thing, but they have different functions. And then what is suffering? That's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful question to contemplate. But you have to be able to do it with some objectivity. Otherwise, you'll just be creating fantasies around your continued idealism about what is good and what is bad and so on. So keep this in mind. And you do have a capacity to have a conversation and communion with God, divine consciousness, your greater self. But it takes some commitment and some development and some trust within yourself, and trial and error, and making mistakes, and continuing day in and day out until the knowing is as peaceful and clear as it can be. And it doesn't matter what anyone else says, you know what's true based on the questions you asked.